Today on Sounding Off, my old friend, Produce Like a Pro's Warren Huart, who I can only describe as marvelous. It's coming up next. Warren, how you doing?
I'm marvelous. How are you?
I'm very good. Let me ask you some questions here, Warren. Now, you and I, we've talked on when you interviewed me at the NAMM show, and
It was a lot of fun.
And we talked about the session that we did back in the early 2000s. But I wanted to ask you when you started getting into doing stuff on the internet and recording on the internet. Tell me how that came about. Tell me how you got into that and what made you start doing that.
Thanks. It's a huge question. I came to YouTube, I think, a little bit late, just because like friends of mine like Tim Pierce had been doing it for like 2 or 3 years, and I also know Marty Schwartz. I'm sure you've seen him.
Yeah, of course.
He's amazing, and I loved these guys on YouTube that were able to. I think they were able to bring people into our industry that would have just felt like they're being ignored. I think that's one of the biggest things about YouTube. Is that you've got some really big famous forums where you can go, but there's a big barrier to entry for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
They'll come in and they'll be told that they can't record unless they have this mic with that mic pre and blah, all that stuff. And yeah, you and I know most of the music that we grew up listening to was recorded by kids.
Right.
It was recorded by, I think Jeff Emmerich was 19 when he did Revolver.
Oh yeah.
So I wanted to. I think for me, I wanted to be in the middle because, you've got Graham with Recording Revolution, who's starting people. He's starting people off, and it's my hat's off to him from starting off. And then you've got Dave at Pensado's place, and I just wanted to be in the middle. I wanted to connect guys like you and I, professionals with kids, and just connect the whole thing together. And I'll be honest, though, I'm blown away by your channel. And one of the things that I love about your channel and is so heartwarming, and this is huge for people watching, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way, is that you do such high-level, high-quality stuff, and you get an audience. Because one of the biggest fears when you do stuff for a lot of people is that it goes over their heads or they're not interested. So I'm so excited that you can put out a video on, I don't know, how to use a Mixolydian or something like that, and you get 15,000 people watching it. Don't you think that's beautiful that there are so many people out there that want to know? Very heartwarming that there is a community of people that really care about music in a very passionate way. So thanks for doing that, because I think it's quite daring.
Well,
I know it's what you know. You know how to. You're a great jazz guitar player, and I don't know if many people know this, but you used to teach that before you got into production full time. And so you've got many, many skills. You've got the producer, engineering, songwriting skill, mixed in with the fact that you really are an incredibly accomplished musician who understands how to teach this. And the fact that, and there's lots of people that are also like that, but they don't have the ability to connect like you do. So I just wanted to get that out in the open. I'm very excited. People just started messaging me. Have you seen Rick Beato's got a channel? Rick Beato's got a channel. And within like 6 months, it was like growing so fast. And it's great because it's great for you, but it's also equally as great that people want to know about this stuff. And it makes me feel really good and also reinforces for me that it doesn't always just have to be dumb 6-4-1-5 songs.
But usually it does, though.
Yeah.
Warren, when I walked into NAMM and I saw you there, it was very funny because literally you were the first person I saw, and I just walked in and my son Dylan goes, "So what time are we leaving?" That's the first thing he says.
My son would have done exactly the same thing. They're the same age. He would have done the same thing.
It was just funny. Really? So he's like that too. Then that's great.
I think it's totally blasé for our kids, isn't it? They're around this all day. You've got a beautiful studio setup. I'm blessed to have a beautiful studio setup. For them, it's nothing exciting about it.
Warren, tell me about that tape machine back there. How often do you use that?
Not as often as
you'd like.
As I'd like. And not because there isn't people that want to. It's the same word. We hear this every day. You're tired of hearing this word as I am. Budget.
Yeah.
It's just budget. It starts primarily, literally, tape stock. I mean, tape stock is expensive. I was blessed to do some big records like Aerosmith where budget is not a problem. So we ran reels and reels of tape, and we also used the clasp system and did tons of fun things. There was an artist I did a couple of years ago called Andy Palmer, who's sort of like a Tom Waits. I hate using Tom Waits as an analogy because he's more than that, but it's an easy kind of way for people to understand what he does. So he uses like a lot of jazz musicians, a lot of incredible players. And so it was more about, getting the musicians in the right place in the room and capturing the sound, and tape made perfect sense. But as a funny sideline, I did the recording and then I came to mix it on the SSL and I dumped it into Pro Tools to mix it.
Right.
It just was easier to have a couple of tools in there. And I had this kid, and he was a couple of years out of recording school. And I said, can you set up the mix? And I gave him all the outputs, how I wanted it to be. You're going to love this. And I left because my house is over there. And I came back in. He goes, I think we have a problem. And I'm like, what is it? He goes, it's really noisy. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he pressed play and it was.
When people come into my studio and they see my tape machine and they say, what is that? And I'm just like, never mind.
Yeah. It's just always hilarious. I'm like, that's tape hiss. And he's like, tape hiss? What's that? And he's from recording schools. I mean, look, I don't want to be one of those guys. I know you don't either. I don't want to be one of those kind of old guys going, oh, you don't know how it is. But I do think that, and I know you understand this, I do think for us to understand where we are now, we need to know where we came from, know. And, tape is a wonderful medium. But I do think the best thing about tape is the mindset that it creates. The fact that, you do a take and then you come back into the control room, the whole band's there, and they're listening and they're going, oh, yeah, I'm always on top on the chorus, so I better lay back.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah, people pay way more attention to their performances. When you can't just fix them easily, nobody wants to be the guy that they have to punch in after the take.
Absolutely. I remember doing my first album in America with Don Smith on tape. And Don, it was Brian McLeod playing drums, who's obviously an insane musician. And I was playing bass. I was playing guitar as well, but I was, laying down the bass track with Brian. And he would push and pull the song and tempo-wise all over the place, but it was so exciting. And there was no one part of me that thought that he was wrong. It was me not locking with him.
Right.
And I think it wasn't until we got actively into DAWs that we started questioning the drummer. I mean, of course, you have bands where the drummer had to be replaced, he couldn't play the groove, whatever. But most of the time, that was part of what we loved about drummers. We loved Keith Moon, that he would do a fill that was twice as fast as the rest of it. It was like da 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 da, doom doom, and it just added excitement. I don't think anybody in their right mind would say that Keith Moon wasn't an amazing drummer. But by the grid,
I think people just get so used to hearing things that are perfectly metronomically in time. When they hear something that's slightly out, it sounds weird to them.
I did a couple of years as a staff producer on the show X Factor. And they would have us they usually would make us take a song and then do a really random twisted version. But they wanted me to do Back in Black.
Right. And
I was thinking to myself, well, Mutt Lange. I mean, Mutt Lange had that reputation, or has that reputation, of everything being like perfect. And listen to those Def Leppard records and those Shania Twain records. They're like masterpieces of perfection, of huge niche and production. So I didn't even think twice about it. So I loaded the MP3 into my session, and I was like, I'm gonna keep the feel and the groove, and because they wanted an accurate cover. And you are right, it is all over the bleeding pace. I actually think that it speeds up, gets to the chorus, and I believe the second verse, correct me if I'm wrong, is slower than the first.
Yeah, I think
which
it is.
Makes absolutely no sense. If you were to thinking about it, you'd think the song should grow exponentially, but it doesn't. So yeah, that's a great example, because I've experienced that song. And not what I anticipated at all.
Okay, I want to ask you about current gear in your rig. Do you run Pro Tools 12? I assume you run Pro Tools.
I run two different types of Pro Tools.
Okay.
I'm going to scare people here. I run 9 on my SSL.
Okay.
And I run 12 when I'm in the box. I run 12.8.2 when I'm in the box. I never went to 10 or 11, and John Connolly, who's like one of the LA kind of ex-Avid 20-year employee, like was recommended to me by Avid, is like, you've got, hundreds of hard drives with hundreds of sessions that run smoothly through your SSL, and Avid are going to hate you for saying this. Why would you change? However, I do run 12.8.2, I believe, the latest version, when I'm mixing in the box.
Yep.
And tracking in the box and building stuff. So I have laptops with 10, and I think Eric, who works for me, has 11. So we have to live in all different worlds. But for my SSL, if I'm mixing on the console, I'm still on 9.
Okay,
now,
so what would the OS that you're running be then, if you're on 9? Do you know?
I'm gonna look. It's probably 10.6.8, isn't it? Isn't that kind of standard?
I run 10 in my control room, Pro Tools 10, yep. And I run 12 on this computer that we're on.
Right.
Same thing. And I never update anything. I never update the operating system. You just leave it like it is, and it runs.
Yeah. I have my main SSL computer I use for my SSL is a 2009 Mac Pro.
That's what I have.
So it's 8 years old.
Yep.
But I own about $100,000 worth of Apple equipment like you do. iPads, cell phones, laptops. I've got like 5. I'm sure you have as well. I saw your video, which I loved and reposted. And people love that.
People love it or they hate it, man.
Well, it's like,
you get all the fanboys that want to. I read the comments and I laugh. I love it.
But I'm a fan of Apple as well. But at the same time, I can take the criticism. I mean, isn't that kind of, you know what I mean? It's like, if you're building, I mean, look, I like Formula One, for instance, a lot of, Formula One. And so Mercedes, Hamilton's our guys, an English driver driving this car. He's still winning, but he's not driving what people consider to be the fastest car. The Ferrari's the better car. So what do? You get people like having these battles about what car versus what driver. And it's just like, you know what I mean? It's like I get it, but there's more to it. Now, obviously, PCs are so much more friendlier to people because you can. The facts are there. The PCs are friendly. You can build things cheaper and faster. However, Apple's customer care is insane. I bought the very first version of the iPad, whatever, like 6-7 years ago, whenever it came out, 8 years ago. I bought it, and I had it 2 weeks, and it stopped working. And it just wouldn't connect to the Wi-Fi, which rendered it completely useless. So I went online, and after about 20 minutes of research, I found out that the serial number I had was one of 10,000 that had the wrong chip in it. So I call Apple at the Genius Bar, set up a time to go down there. It was like 12:35. I get at 12:34, and at 12:35 they go, "Mr. Huart," and I'm like, "Did that just happen?" Packed place. I walk up at the allotted time. I lay the iPad down, and I say, "I checked. This one is one of the ones, serial number, blah 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 blah, that has a bad chip." He flipped it over. He typed in the serial number, and he went, "You're correct. Let me get you a new one." And I was out in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's like apples and oranges, you know what I mean? It's like we pay that premium for Apple products, and they do have issues, but they look after us enough that we deal with it. Guys like you and I are blessed that we have a platform and people, pay attention to us, but there's lots of people, as you know, that are very, very talented that can't get noticed, Just the reason why I started my channel, and I'm sure you do as well. I'm trying to just connect people, and make it, and really have a proper community. And that's a big deal for me because I didn't really grow up with any massive advantages to doing music. So, so for me, it's like a sense of community is a big, big deal.
Beyond your YouTube channel, your main destination is your actual website. YouTube you would say, is kind of just an arm of promotion, essentially, for you, and another different way to communicate via social media. But your website is actually, your Produce Like a Pro website is your destination spot.
Yeah, I host videos on there that are unique, but every month I give out multi-tracks, and I go a little differently because, look, you know this, every single person's site is just the same thing, isn't it? It's all mix, 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 mix. Something to mix with this, mix that, mix this, mix that. And we're the old guys in the business, over 40, and anybody over 40 that didn't grow up in digital, that was always like the icing on the cake. Most of the records that you and I grew up loving, like the Queens, the Zeppelins, the Pink Floyds, the Who, and pretty much most stuff, even through a lot of the 80s, didn't have an external mixer on it. You
That's
could pull
true.
up you could pull up an album that Hugh Padgham did in the late 70s, early 80s, which is still arguably some of the best sounding records ever. Pull them up on the fader and pan them the direction that they are, and it sounds like the album.
Let me ask you this. Speaking of Hugh Padgham, did he actually mix the Police records? Because he did Ghost in the Machine, I think, and did Synchronicity. Did he
I
mix
believe so.
those?
I believe so. I think you would, before mixers was a specific credit, because when I grew up, when we were kids, you'd look at the back of the albums and there wasn't a mix credit.
Never.
It was just produced and engineered.
Yeah.
So, it was Roy Thomas Baker, for instance, sitting there with, Mac or whoever the engineer was on those records, you know, deciding, oh, that's it, we mixed, we're finished.
Right.
They didn't send Bohemian Rhapsody to Bob Clearmountain. No disrespect, Bob, but Bob didn't mix. And how would you be able to mix Bohemian Rhapsody unless you were actually the guy that recorded it?
Yeah.
It's so tied in. You've got 16 tracks like Killer Queen. I'm sure you've heard those multi-track. There's one track with all of the stacked
50 vocals.
guitars.
I know, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
As far as outboard gear versus inboard gear, as I'll call it, if you were going to suggest to somebody, people ask me this question all the time, and I'm not sure how to answer it, but what do you suggest to somebody that is starting out and wants to buy a basic rig? What would you suggest?
I think that it's that ugly word again, isn't it? It's like, what's your budget? Because you're going to get getting it in the best possible way, obviously, is a big deal. But, the basic chip is the same. It's the hardware around it. The digital conversion is the same, but obviously not very good hardware, lack of transformers, stuff like that might play into it. But, you could argue that with some of the plugins available these days that you could quite easily record it in relatively thin without all of those wonderful transformers or tubes or whatever coloring the sound, and then do it with plugins. I personally think there's like 8 right answers to that. I think you could go out and buy an Audient 1 or 2 input. You could buy a Focusrite 1 or 2 input, like those, inexpensive kind of IOs. Use a 57 quality dynamic or a mid-price $200 to $300 condenser. And if you're creative, you could probably get a pretty darn good sounding album. I really do. You just have to know when you're going to need better equipment, which means if you're going to record a band like a jazz band, it's not going to work like that. Right. You're going to need multiple mic pre's. You're going to need large diaphragm, really beautiful sounding condensers, and you're going to need to be in a room that has a good enough acoustics that you can move your musicians around. And I did a video a couple of weeks ago, like a week ago, which was called "There's No One Way to Record," and you understand this, because people were criticizing stuff that was hip hop, and then other people were criticizing stuff that was rock, and then country. And I'm just like, if we're going to be professional producers, engineers, mixers, mastering engineers, we've got to have a lot of techniques. There's, just knowing how to mix, using XYZ plugins, that's great. But then, how are you going to be able to record a jazz band? But then if you record jazz, how will you be able to do EDM music? It's like, and everything has validity, you know that. Because it was Beethoven for centuries, and then jazz and blues came along, and I'm sure all the classical guys were like, this isn't pure. I can't believe it.
They still say that.
Yeah, still say that, yeah. And then the jazz guys hated the rock and roll and country, and then now the rock guys all hate the pop EDM stuff. And my love is putting a microphone in front of something and capturing it. I don't believe there's anything better than a human performance. And I'm so glad to see people loving your channel, because that is your emphasis on real performance, and the fact that you interview people that are great performers. And I love all of that, but I'm not that closed off that I don't sometimes hear a song and go, ooh. You hear like Gnarls Barkley, when that came out, you were like, to say that song Crazy wasn't absolutely amazing, even though we all know 99% of it was a loop and was a sample, and there probably was no microphones except for the vocal.
And that's the thing. That's what you spend your money on. That's what I tell people. Spend it on the vocal mic if you're going to spend
exactly.
something. I've done shootouts. I've gone to places like Vintage King up in Nashville, where they had a Pro Tools session just a couple years ago. I went in there and they had a Pro Tools session of every 500 series preamp that they had. And they had the same performance going through the things that they had looped, acoustic guitar and stuff. And to be honest with you, they don't sound that different from one another. You got your Neve ones that maybe have a little bit low mid, more low mid, and people, oh, I swear it's so much better and everything. It's, for me,
Yep.
I mean, if I plug in my Neves, it's when you engage the EQ and do stuff that you really can tell the difference. But with the mic pre's, are they really going to make a difference? Are they going to make as much difference as the microphone is going to make? Really, that's your first,
No, I agree. I think, I mean, I do, like you, I do think they make, they can definitely make a difference. But I agree, any engineer, producer, especially the guys that have been doing this for 50 years and have acquired knowledge and don't have any allegiance to products will just say, you just have, whatever you start with is as good as it's going to get. Simple as that.
Yeah.
You start with a great voice, a great microphone, a good quality cable going into a good quality mic pre. As long as it starts good, you're in a great place. It's like, yeah, and I agree. An amazing performance outweighs any kind of recording quality. I mean, I was talking to a mastering engineer the other day who was saying, Harry Weinberg was saying it, that they were mastering stuff off cassette because in the 80s, maybe the tapes got lost, and the only thing they had was when they were taking it didn't happen very often, but it happened.
Sure.
They had the mix printed on a cassette for the producer to listen to driving home, and then something terrible happened. But they're not going to go around and advertise that blah 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 album that we all love, track 4 is from a cassette. But stuff happens. It happens now, happens then. File management there's a whole other. But the point is like, it's the actual song and the performance and everything which is the most important thing. Kills any requirement of gear. But I do agree. I think 300 seems to be entry point for a half decent large diaphragm condenser. I think once you can start getting the 500 to 1,000, it pretty much opens up. Somebody said to me the other day, they said, "Oh, that Lewitt for $1,200, is it better than the Mojave for $1,200?" And I was like, I like the Lewitt. I'm a big fan of it. I've never used the Mojave, but I imagine it's just as good. And they're like, "Oh, what's the differences?" And I'm like, we live in a wonderfully technologically advanced world. When you and I were kids, there was Fender, Gibson. There was like Fender, Gibson, Ibanez, Yamaha, and then a bunch of the really expensive
Hondo.
Yeah, exactly. And we start off with the Hondo 2, and then we gravitate to the Yamaha, and they were actually really good guitars for the money. And then eventually we'd save up for the Strat or the Telecaster, and that was. Now you walk into a music store and there's $600 guitars that you pick up and go, wow, this plays like what used to be a $2,500 Fender or a $2,500. It's a great time to be making music. I mean, geez, I started with 2 cassette players, recording on one and putting the cassette parents' stereo system, and then it was 4-track, and then it was ADATs, and primitive reel-to-reels, ADATs, and then DAWs came along. It's like, and people were making, I mean, arguably one of the biggest selling records of all time. Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, that was all done on ADATs.
That's right.
I mean, honestly, they were great. They were an extension of what Zappa and Steely Dan were doing in the 70s, where they were printing their masters onto video cassettes.
Yeah. Speaking of this, you've interviewed a lot of people, and what do you personally do sampling rate when you're going to set up a session? 44, 48, 88, 96, what?
48, 24-bit.
Okay.
Yep. Some of my favorite mixers are at 48. They might not, talk about that, but they do. It's when you're running bigger sessions, you've got to deal with CPU. There was a memo that went around labels, and have you heard about this? Went around label last year. Inadvertently got involved in it because a friend of mine at Capitol called me and said, "What do you think of this memo?" before it went out. And I was like, look, and all my peers are going to get mad at me. And I'm like, look, Slate did the subscription model, and now you can get these high quality plugins. Mac DSP are doing it. Everybody's moving into this. A kid with a laptop can now run 88 to 96, 192 so easily. But if we as professionals start going, "Oh, we've got to buy new hardware," and start sulking, we're going to look like idiots. We're going to look like we're, like dinosaurs. But that was the response to that memo when labels started asking for everything they're trying to anticipate where we're going with immersive audio and all of the virtual stuff. They're trying to anticipate, and my hat's off to them. We can all criticize labels for some things, but at least they're trying to force everybody to deliver higher quality stuff so that eventually, you'll be able to sit there in your virtual reality world and have this super high quality stuff. But yeah, I didn't back the sort of response, because the response from the industry was like, no, we don't need to go to that. I mean, I'd rather not. I'd rather not have to buy new hardware, although my hardware can do it. But I don't want to be a Luddite. I don't want to be a dinosaur that a 15-year-old kid is like criticizing for not changing with the times, because Slate, Mac DSP, Waves, everybody has moved to that world. They're making it easy. They're making it easy for kids to be at higher sample and bit rates. So why the heck shouldn't we? We need to be there too. But that's my long answer. I am mainly at 48K because of some of the larger sessions I get, but I am very aware that that's got to change.
As far as the subscription model for plugins,
yeah.
Do you think that is helping those companies? I mean, you must talk to people from all these companies. Is that made a huge difference?
I think business-wise, people like subscription models. Yeah. I was on vacation last year, and I was fortunate to meet someone from Adobe who was in marketing at Adobe. And I told him what I did, and I talked to them, and they're like, we moved to subscription a year or two ago.
Sure.
So it was like over a year ago. And I was like, how did it affect? He said, everybody screamed about it and complained. And he goes, but our profits went through the roof.
And you get the updates all the time, so you never have to think about that. That's the plus side of it, and that's the plus side with doing. I mean, I do the subscription for Pro Tools 12 now. You don't think about it anymore. You just
It's a double-edged sword. It's like it's better for the companies; they're making more money, and it's better for us. So isn't that? That's what it should be. Yes, mutually beneficial.
I'm surprised that they honestly didn't do it years ago. It seems like
That's our business, isn't it?
That is our business. They were always slow on the draw from changing over with the file sharing and all that, and kind of collapsed the business there for a while.
Yeah, here we are. We're complaining about Spotify, which in America is like 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah.
We're complaining about Spotify, and yet we've had Netflix for how long? 8 years?
Forever.
Yeah.
When they were sending out DVDs only, they hardly had any streaming movies.
No. You can't stream it like you do with Netflix. You've got to go to a Walmart or a Best Buy or wherever and go and buy a CD from over the counter. But in the meantime, you can just stream any movie or TV show that you want. Spotify's a big conversation, and I have very good friends on both sides of the argument. Unfortunately, the reality is most people are on the negative side of it.
Yeah.
And I get a little frustrated by that because I see the good it's done for some of the local and smaller artists. I have an artist called, he's going to hate me saying about, giving his finances away, but David from the Workday Release. And he is a really hard worker, and he's making $1,500, sometimes $2,000 a month on a good month from Spotify. And nobody knows who he is. But that's the difference when you're a 20-something-year-old working an extra 100 hours at the bar that month.
Sure, of course.
So
it's a huge difference.
But there was no way there was no independent artists, 20 years ago making a couple of $1,000s a month in CD sales.
Never. How often do you have records where people go and want to make vinyl? And what do you do differently when you do that?
Oh, that's great. Great question. I actually encourage it. I worked with a band called Robert John and the Wreck, and we did a live album in one day at Sunset Sound. So we went down to Sunset Sound, we tracked the whole album live, and then mixed it in a day over here. And we put that on vinyl because they're like a 70s retro rock band. Mm-hmm. And kids, and they've got a young audience, especially over in Europe, they're like, I wouldn't say big stars, but they're very successful in Germany. So they go play live over there. And people want to buy vinyl because of the experience. It's got all of that artwork in there. And now, of course, it comes with a free download card. I read, I don't know, I'm making up a number here, but I read a large proportion of people that buy vinyl don't actually listen to it. But here's, everybody talks about the 10,000 hours and everybody talks about 80-20 rule. I always look at the stuff we talk about. I never want to sound like I'm being resentful. When I talk about the old industry and the new industry and how things have changed, I don't say it out of like resentment for the old bad way it was run. I look at it from an outlier point of view of going, well, when something works or doesn't work, what do we learn from that? And for me, it's like, if you're, the 80-20 rule, if you're like your fans, of which, you've got, 150,000 people that love you, there's going to be a small percentage of that will give you money for something because they're such a big fan of yours. Mm-hmm. And that is the same thing for artists. They go out, they play a show, they have some vinyl, and maybe they sell 100 copies of vinyl at a really big show with like 5,000 people. They play a festival. And most of the people won't listen to it, but that's not the point. They're buying it because they want the experience. They will have the download card, so they'll get to own the music, but they want to reward the band that they love.
Yeah.
How many T-shirts have you bought and maybe only worn at the show? You go to the show and you're like, wow, it's Roger Daltrey, The Who. You buy the T-shirt, you put it on, you have a great time, you go home, put it in the wash, and you never wear it again.
Right.
I've done it 20 times. But you wanted to reward it. You wanted to show. You wanted like to take a photograph with your wife and your friends at the show. It's The Who. You got the Who T-shirt on.
Of course.
Yeah, it's all part of the experience. And yeah, you gave them $30 or $40, but you feel good about it. I actually actively encourage my artists to do vinyl.
Okay, when you do that, do you do a separate mix, digital mix from your vinyl mix?
I don't do a different mix, but I make sure that the guys mastering it know what they're doing, because it's a whole different process. But it's a really interesting question you bring up. Hopefully people will get to this portion of the interview. But when you're mixing, and I'm staring right at the camera here because you're slightly off center, so I apologize to people that make it look like I'm slightly looking to one side. But if you're mixing EDM stuff, be really, really careful with some of those sounds, because they're giving you this artificial widening, especially on bass lines, when they make the bass line feel like it's coming out of both speakers. The only way to make things sound super wide, wider than reality, is to screw with the phase, with the polarity. Problem is, you can't do that on vinyl. It will not play. So when I was talking to Pete Lyman, who's arguably, everybody masters vinyl, don't get me wrong, but Pete's probably arguably the number one vinyl mastering guy in the country. Which probably makes him one of the biggest in the world. He said he's constantly going back to EDM artists and hip-hop artists and saying, hey, I can't master this. You can't use all these widening pieces of software, all this. It will just jump out of the grooves,
yeah.
So that is an interesting point, because even though I do electronic stuff, it's usually blended with real instruments, and I've been doing this a long time, and like yourself, phase is one of the biggest things for me. I put on a pair of headphones, I'm like, whoa, I can't listen to something for more than a second if there's a polarity issue. Now, in my academy, when I'm doing the Feedback Fridays, it's the first thing that happens. If somebody is using a widening plugin on an intro guitar part, I'm just like, guys, you got to be careful. This is not going to work. And, when it feels like the guitar's like this, and it's just like it doesn't play, and it makes no sense, because you'll be in like a restaurant or something like that, and it's just the worst sound. You got polarity issues,
So Warren, I see this outboard gear in the back. So most of that you use tracking wise, correct?
A bit of both. What do you see? Let me see what your shot is.
I see some Pultex, it looks like, back there.
Yeah, I've got, so the silver things, yes, to the left is Pultex.
Yep.
And to the right are actually Crown tube mic pre's from a tape decks.
Nice.
And I don't use them that often as mic pre's, to be honest. I've got lots of tubes, valves I can throw in the way. I actually use them, Jack Douglas introduced me to it, for the basic EQ. They've got a treble and a bass, which is like, it's probably hard to see, but it's to the right, the two little knobs to the right like this. They're just a treble and a bass. And I just use them as basic EQs. They just sound like really good EQ. When I first started recording, I'm sure you went through the same process, I really wanted like big flashy consoles back in the 80s and early 90s. Because I wanted to get in there and do like all these fine EQ moves and all this. And I felt like my mixes and my music was going to become 100 times better if I could just go in there and like dial in all this EQ. And then I started working with guys that knew what they were talking about, and they would just like go over and make it slightly brighter. And I was like, wait there, but you've got all this semi-parametric. And they're like, yeah, if we need to fix something, if we want to pull out a little bit of a frequency or boost a specific frequency, you know, to make a dense, like a lead guitar cut through a dense mix, maybe they'll put up like a, you know, even like 2.5 or 3K and then pull it out of the other heavy guitars. And I was like, oh, I was expecting like everything to be like crazy EQing and stuff like that. So I find that things like the crown here is just good for like general, just make it sound a bit fatter, boom, add a bit of bass. Otherwise, the stuff that's underneath in the 500 series, the 2 APIs are actually permanently on the kick and the snare. And the kick has like a 60 boost, some, you know, 63 boost, a little bit of like 2 or 3K for a little bit of click, and a bit of low mid cut. Nothing that's going to change the world. It's just what you would kind of expect. And I love the sound of APIs with the 2520s. It's a luxury. I can do it in the box, and I've done it many, many times in the box. Mm-hmm. But like a lot of guys, you know, we get stuff and then we set it up and kind of leave it and then get used to pushing through it. Like I did a mix breakdown this week. It's going to come out on YouTube, and I was talking about the vocal. And I was mixing through the way that I have a generically set up vocal where I have some air on it. So I might add a little extra de-esser inside of Pro Tools before it gets to there. But that's, I always think of like Crystal Algae. Like I heard somebody say, Crystal Algae mixes so quickly, you know, how can he charge so much money for mixing quickly? And I remember looking them straight in the face going, Crystal Algae has been mixing records that you have been buying for like 30 or 40 years. You know, he didn't just wake up yesterday and spend 20 minutes. So whatever he might do, if he goes and reaches over, or any of us goes and reach over and adjust something, there's 35 years of information that goes to boost or cut that frequency. And I think that's very important.
Well
when
said.
It looks like, yeah, and it's tough, you know, because I get it. When I was a young whippersnapper, a young buck who thought he knew everything, I would sit in the room and I'd have a producer and I'd be thinking, he's not saying anything. Why isn't he saying anything? And then like halfway through the day, he'd go, oh, I don't like the bridge. You need to make it shorter. You need to do this. And then late at night, we're all bands all sitting around. We're going, yeah, I mean, it was cool that he changed the bridge, but that's all he did. No, what he did is he hired an amazing engineer, a great room, maybe, you know, all of that acquired knowledge. And sometimes the best producers say very little, and sometimes they say a lot. And then I found out during a process of recording that when you're making an album back in, you know, like the old days of 6 weeks of making a record, you have days when, as a producer, you're in there like completely rewriting the songs, changing the tempos and the keys and the lyrics and the melodies and everything. And then other days, you're just like, this is beautiful. You guys are amazing. I'm just going to throw up some mics. And I think that is great production. It's like, as Dave Jordan says, anybody can reach over and turn a knob. Anybody can do it. Just know when to do it. I remember mixing, recording an album, doing the rough mixes and sending it to Tim Palmer. And when the mixes came back, they sounded like exactly like my mixes, with one massive major difference. The low end was amazing. It just had this kind of like underneath sound of the kick that was just kind of whom, and the bass was like singing. And I was just like, but if you took that out, everything else was in the same mid-range. And I was just like, I was totally frustrated. So I get him on the phone and I'm like, Tim, how are you doing this? And between him and Jack Douglas, I learned that trick about separating the DI and the bass and using the DI only for the low end and then using the bass mic, just the amp only for the personality.
Yeah.
And I know that's a commonplace thing, but for the longest time, that was a differentiator between the big mixers and everybody else. All the big mixers knew that was the way to get that low end to sing on the DI. Now it's pretty common knowledge. And then the other thing was that, and that was Jack Douglas who taught me that.
What do you do when you're not recording? What are your hobbies? You got any hobbies?
Well, it's funny, I have kids.
Yeah.
So, you know, so like Sunday is pretty much my 3-year-old daughter sitting on my lap pretty much the whole day.
Okay.
So it's like, even if I'm having to do emails and answer questions, So yeah, time with my kids. I'm blessed that as busy as I am, my house is just there.
Yeah.
So I do get pulled out quite a lot. In fact, was that my wife just calling? Oh, it wasn't apparently. But normally, we get to interact as much as possible. But yes, at this moment, it is insanely busy. I've got the YouTube channel. I have the Produce Like a Pro Academy. And I also, I just did 2 weeks mixing Rick Springfield's new album. I then did a week with Conrad Sewell, who's like this huge Australian artist who had a massive worldwide hit with Kygo with that song Firestorm, Stone, sorry. And I just did a week with him. And, so I'm like still making records that people buy, and in between juggling all of this stuff. I talk about this a lot. I go, am I prepared at one stage to like dip my toe completely in one thing or the other? Sorry, not just dip my toe, immerse myself fully in like the online mentoring stuff. I feel like hopefully part of my appeal is the fact that what I'm doing is showing people what it's really like. Because, we're talking about the extremes of the YouTube channels. Most of the YouTube channels aren't actually professional. And because they're not professionals, they're teaching stuff which may or may not actually work in the real world. And then, of course, I'm not like retired or on the twilight of my career. So I'm not like trying to find a way to make extra money. It's like I'm sort of slap bang in the middle trying to figure it all out. I try as often as possible to stop for dinner at 6.
Okay.
And then if I've got evening sessions, I'm back in at 8. You're good at doing the streaming live. I'm not sure if
you
it's
just started
for me.
doing that, didn't you?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if it's for me because I'm too ADD. I'm
you
not
get distracted
massively
by what's on the screen, right?
Yeah, and I answer questions and I try to be really attentive to people. I mean, that's presumably why we go live stream, but when there's 100 people asking you questions, it's very hard to keep the focus, at least it is for me. Yeah, there's 2 things that YouTube's done that I don't like recently. I don't like that, I don't like that they don't keep those comments up. That's kind of foolish.
Yeah.
Because when Facebook does it, they stay up so people can understand the dialogue that's going up. So I don't know why they don't allow those to remain.
Yeah.
I mean, because sometimes, I'm sure you're the same way, I've got like 300 comments going on that pertain, like you say, to the video, and suddenly they just start again from scratch. When I'm engaging with people or they're writing to me, I'm thinking about that all the time, because just because somebody's rich or famous or whatever, or even successful, talented, doesn't make them any better or worse than anybody else. And I find diamonds in the rough all the time. And that's one of the great things about the Academy thing, is that everybody gets to mix there. And sometimes they do better mixes than me, and sometimes they do as good a mixes as it ever got from a Serban or a Brower or Crystal Algae. And it's no disrespect. I'm not saying those guys aren't amazing. They are amazing, but there is actually other amazing people out there.
Sure.
So, I know you understand this. That's one of the biggest benefits of doing what we do, is that we can be at least a small part of that we can be a mentor to so many. So it's great. That's why I applaud you again. I know I've said it a couple of times, but I love the fact that you are taking on a high level of learning. And I'll say it one more time, I love that people are embracing it. Because as they say in America, who would have thunk it?
Not me.
No, you probably thought you were going to get like 10 or 20,000 subscribers over like 5, 10 years.
No, 10 or 20.
Yeah. I love it, and the conversation and the commentary underneath is so high level.
Except for the Apple ones.
Except for the Apple ones. And when I say high level, I don't mean elitist. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about like the elitist stuff. I'm talking about people that really love music and want to learn, and I love that. And I mean, God bless YouTube for that. I mean, all joking aside, it is an amazing place.
I agree. Warren, thank you so much for being my guest today. You are the man, and I look forward to hanging out more in the future in person. I'd like to once again thank Warren for being my guest today, and I'll leave a link for his YouTube channel and his website in the description below. Thanks for watching.